Hello and welcome to a Quwa Quick Take. Now, I realize I have a big backlog of reader-submitted questions or listener-submitted questions, and I'll get to them this week and next week. But just to Defense Uncut will also be coming back online, as will regular Pulse Check episodes once we sort out both Asim and my schedule and also those of our guests. Rest assured, things are moving in the right direction and we'll get things back under control. Aside from that, I wanted to sort of start this quick take with an ongoing discussion that I've sort of noticed in the Pakistan defense commentary sphere. So recently, Skyroot, a private Indian company, launched its Vikram-1, its first orbital launch vehicle. And that kicked off some discussion in our Pakistani circles about why the Pakistani private sector is lagging so far behind. Now, sure, Pakistan's economy is not large enough to drive Skyroot-like projects anytime soon. Fair enough. I'll concede that immediately. But surely we'd expect to see much more activity these days, right, than what we have right now. Surely the gap shouldn't be this big. And in the middle of that discussion, I came across a video with some genuinely interesting critiques of people who I'd say, including myself, what we say is that the Pakistani government and military, let's just say the state for short, doesn't do enough to support the private sector. So now I want to be very clear about something before I go any further. I'm not here to disparage the person with these views that I'm about to respond to. I'm not going to name them because I want to purely focus on the ideas. Because I believe these ideas, these refrains, genuinely do exist among Pakistan's decision makers. They've probably been percolating in this country for decades, and I think it's a good opportunity, especially within the institutional circles, to sort of revisit these sorts of thoughts. And perhaps one day we can change some perspective, sort of operate with the maxim that whenever I say something, especially in relation to some opposing views, what would be the best case scenario of my, let's say, refutation. And the one thing I've learned over time is that when it comes to policy, it shouldn't be about angering people or making them get into an argument with you or anything. It's more about an exchange of ideas. You like them, great. You want to take them and work on them even further, beautiful. If you don't like them, okay. But we at least had an exchange of ideas, and we can just let the ideas sit in the marketplace and let the buyers decide. So now to be clear, again, it's all about ideas, not personalities or people. So when I went through the video, I think I picked up 5 big themes, or as I call them, refrains. The first one, and I want to take each of them seriously and concede what's true within each one, and then show you, hopefully with actual cases and examples in history where I think those refrains break down. Refrain would be like, if you're not aware, let's say you come up with an idea and someone says, no, that's not doable. That's like the refrain, basically. So the 5 refrains are, number 1, just start small, nobody will stop you, and it'll grow organically. So the idea being, stop complaining, just go out somewhere and just start something. Refrain number 2 is, it's not the military or the government blocking private defense, it's the individual psyche. Number 3, investors and youth don't want to sacrifice the way Bezos or Musk did in the early years. Number 4, what both sides are at fault, but the private sector won't put in the years to build the credibility with the government. And number 5, grand policy wish lists like building your own metallurgy-based gas turbines. They're all impractical. The government isn't interested. So why even talk about it? So let's go. Let's start and discuss each of these. Now, before I go into the first refrain, I want to set up the frame that I'm arguing from, because I think everything after this will depend on it. I'm going to concede that the core idea of the individual responsibility, that's a valid argument. Yes, individuals have agency. Yes, individuals have responsibility. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that effort doesn't matter or that nobody in Pakistan is coasting, because that would be dishonest. But here's my question, and I actually want you all to sit with it. Which individuals are we talking about? Which individual carries the responsibility here? Is it the student or young professional from some middle class or lower middle class family who thinks they're entitled to a paid internship or a job, partly because they just want their career to start going, they want their lives to get going? They might have a family, like of parents and siblings that they have to support in a country where the cost of living is very, very, very clearly not going down. Is that the individual whose choices are going to determine whether Pakistan has an aerospace industry or a vibrant defense industry or a vibrant private sector? Or is it the individual policymaker? Is it the individual decision maker who has access to the state's resources, the public's resources, the resources that the same students and their parents and their grandparents have been paying taxes into for decades? Is it the person who has the means to decide who wins and who loses in an economy, or the person standing at the receiving end of those very decisions? Because those are not the same category of individual, and treating them as if they are is how you end up with a conversation that goes nowhere. I'll put my cards on the table. In any discussion like this, I'm going to weight it roughly 80% on the systems and the individual decision makers, and 20% on individual average people who might be like myself, like others, who might be complaining. And I say that as someone who frankly has had the entire privilege of growing up within the PAF system and within the Gulf sponsored system and with a lot of support in my life. I say this with full recognition that I could not be where I am today without a lot of things going right for me and my family throughout the years. And my perspective is that I'd love for the average person or the majority of people to have access to, at minimum, the same benefits that I'd had, at minimum. So you can imagine my benchmark for this is very high. And I believe that the way you make it happen is not by disparaging individuals, especially those who are trying to hold the system accountable, but by actually holding the system accountable. Because systems run countries. Systems define economies, right? Systems decide, as I said, who wins and who loses. And when those systems aren't working, they have to get fixed. And this is what this discussion is about. So refrain number one, just start small. Nobody will stop you. Okay. So the argument goes, stop complaining, go buy a farmhouse somewhere in the rural areas, start a small drone academy, get some kids building some quadcopters inside your own area and start flying those. Nobody will stop you. It'll grow organically. So the issue is with this is that it's already being done, frankly speaking. And I think it's not a helpful approach because, okay, let's just talk about the drone stuff right away and then sort of build from there. This kind of business is a services business. And with any services business, it depends on a healthy pool of customers. And if your general economy is lagging, you're not going to have very many customers. So if everyone starts dumping into the services side of the equation, they're not going to have very many buyers and their costs are going to have to keep going down, down, down to the point where it becomes unsustainable. So that's already off the charts here. What you want to do, yes, services are a good start, right? It helps people sort of build some skills and get out there and do something, as you said. But from there, it needs to rapidly scale and build up into value-added additions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you need to go from services like providing, let's say, soft things like training to actually providing inputs for those drones. Because here's the thing, right? If there's more people going out there creating services, then you'd ideally want some local companies to go out there and start building those drones that they would provide those services, right? That's like the rationale. So you need to have a plan that gets people from that initial foundation of the services business, wherever it might be. It could be the drone academy. It could be like, I don't know, marketing services, like whatever, right? And then you want to build the links that go all the way to getting them to developing a self-sustaining business that produces tangible products and solutions, not just for the Pakistani market, but also overseas. That would allow them to access that foreign hard currency, right? And the problem with Pakistan's policy environment is that the chain, right, from the beginning and the end, the middle part is missing. How do we get from getting a bunch of kids going out into the rural areas, building their own drone academies, to having those drone academies turn into drone factories? What's the missing piece here? Like, what's the middle piece? And that's the part that no one provides an answer to, because the uncomfortable truth is that answer has to involve policy and regulations, and it's going to involve an uncomfortable discussion for the people in charge. So now, the next point in relation to this is that this sort of idea, it also overlooks some parts of historical reality. Because forget drone academies. Pakistan used to have a vibrant private sector drone ecosystem. So back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, we had several private sector companies who were the main suppliers of drones, both to the armed forces and overseas. These were most notably Integrated Dynamics, SATUMA. And Integrated Dynamics was interesting because they also, and it's probably under some US offset agreement, but they also exported the Border Eagle drone to the United States as well. So the point being is that these companies, so we had a base of people who did have some capacity to design, test, and actually build and supply drones with the support system. What happened to them? Well, if you actually speak to any of them, they'll tell you that NESCOM entered the scene, right? So when NESCOM entered, NESCOM being a public funded entity, right, got into drone development. So that's when the Shahpar series was developed. So you have the Shahpar 1, Shahpar 2, Shahpar 3, and so on. And they started from an earlier point than the private sector, and then over time outmatched and exceeded the private sector. Now, if it was just an issue of us looking at these companies, you might say, well, look at NESCOM, they're so capable. And that's true, but why are they capable? Well, it's because they had access to an endless stream of public money. And this is where the policymakers in the armed forces have decided that NESCOM will be a winner and the private sector companies, like Integrated Dynamics and SATUMA, will be the losers. And this is the issue that we're talking about here. So when we go back to those, we tell people to go out and set up a drone academy out there. There's so many problems with this because number one is actually a regression to what we already had. We already had actual drone companies that were making stuff and they're supplying stuff and they were given the chance to grow and scale or anything, right? And I'll go into why. And if you consider these new entrants that might come in, they're going to be dealing with the same obstacles as their predecessors. They are in fact, and I'll go into some examples about that as well. So this is the kind of situation that economists will call a market failure, right? Where very evidently through mechanisms which aren't natural, just purely policy driven, one group gets preferential treatment and the other doesn't. Because think about it. If we accept that NESCOM started from an earlier point compared to the private sector in, let's say, the year 2001, 2002, then that means that the government decided that the weaker power, the weaker player, just because it's state-owned, will have support through development funding and firm orders compared to the private player, right? And very similarly, the Pakistan Air Force around this time also ordered the Falco UAV from Italy. And in this respect, the Falco UAV had certain performance parameters that the Pakistani private sector wasn't able to provide. But think about this. It was purchased in a transfer technology mechanism. You could have shifted this transfer technology mechanism to the private sector through, it's very common in India and Turkey, through offsets. So the Pakistan Air Force tells Leonardo, or at the time Selex, that we will buy 20 Falco UAVs, or maybe even 200 Falco UAVs, whatever the number. And we need you to do 100% offset in Pakistan. And we would prefer that you do this offset through local manufacturing in Pakistan to the private sector. And suddenly what happens is that let's say $100 million that you spent on those Falco UAV drones, maybe even 100%, maybe 150% of that money goes back into Pakistan through an investment. So Leonardo says, you know what, we're going to invest $50 million into Integrated Dynamics. They're going to be our domestic partner to co-produce the Falco UAV for the Pakistan Air Force. And once that order is complete, because we're investing now in Integrated Dynamics, we want them to make a profit. So we are going to also encourage Integrated Dynamics to export this drone overseas. And suddenly these drones are being built in Pakistan. Pakistanis are getting hired on the basis of exports, and suddenly you start pulling in some of that nice hard currency or foreign currency, basically. So that is the alternative model. But what happened was that the Pakistan Air Force decided that in this whole equation where they're going to take public money, that the SOE, PAC would be the winner. And now we ask, where is the Falco drone? Is PAC still manufacturing the Falco drone? No, crickets, basically. So this is the issue. And this is where I think that example really falls apart in my perspective. And it really overlooks the reality that just 25 years ago, the government decided, the state decided who was going to own the first wave of the drone industry. And now we're on the cusp of another drone boom, and we might be making the same mistakes again. So you already have, again, private Pakistani companies developing interceptor drones, developing loitering munitions. There are even some who told me straight up that they can design and develop their own miniature turbojets and rocket boosters or rocket motors. And there are just a bunch of different policy issues that they need approvals for in order to get these programs going, right? But they cannot, because those blockers exist. And in parallel, the public money, the money that taxpayers pay, the money that the same business owners that we're talking about, they also pay, right? Because, these sorts of manufacturing businesses, you can't really hide money here, unlike, let's say, some other industries. So this stuff gets recorded and they have to pay their taxes. All these people are paying into a system that is actively competing against them and reducing their ability to compete, right? Their ability to grow. And this is the fundamental policy issue. And it's really hard for me to sort of be succinct here, because the more I start discussing it, the more I unravel from just a discussion, because it's so complex and thorough. It's really hard to be reductionist on this and reduce it down to just some individual psyches or people being lazy or whatever. It's not that at all. If there's a point you need to take away from this, is that we have a systemic problem, a system level problem, and it requires a system level solution, right? That's the issue here. So obviously today, NESCOM is the dominant supplier. They have the Shahpar series, for example, and then Integrated Dynamics and SATUMA were not able to evolve past the points that they had. Now, the second question is, well, why weren't they able to evolve? And that's a good question. And part of it is the fact that basically the armed forces, they operate on a model called no cost, no obligation, meaning that if there's a requirement and the private sector is interested in engaging that requirement, the private sector is responsible for summoning up all the investment to produce the good. And even if that product or solution meets the armed forces' needs, the armed forces aren't obliged at any level to commit to orders. So what this creates is basically a dead incentive scenario. No one in the private sector has an incentive to put in money into an armed forces program because the armed forces will not help them with the development funding, nor will they commit to any firm orders at the end of it. So you're sort of left in a situation as well, why am I going to invest in something where there's no chance of a return on investment? This is not how a profit and loss model works. Now, this works for a public state-owned enterprise because you can then tap that sweet taxpayer money and pump your programs however long they take, however delayed they might get with that money. And that assures that the program stays alive, true, but then it also basically disadvantages the private sector because now the government, the state, it could have been using that development funding in the private sector. And the private sector has to work much more efficiently, right? It has to, I mean, obviously there can be some shenanigans. You have that where like shady defense contracts and stuff. So you have to have other systems to sort of correct that as well. But let's say like in broad strokes, the private sector is accountable to profit and loss, right? If it's going into loss, then it's not going to survive very long. Right, so it has to generate profit. So, and again, in regards to drones, the point is that we already have private sector players who know how to develop drones. The thing that's constraining them, I've spoken to about 5 different companies, all private sector, and 5 out of 5, they'll tell me the thing that constrains them is just the lack of capital to take their development to the next stage. So they're either bootstrapping it on very gradual piecemeal funding that they actually generate through their other businesses. So, they're already involved in some other sectors of the economy. Many of them are actually, I think all 5 of them are exporting stuff too already in different sectors. And then they basically use some of the proceeds, which they're allowed to by their, say, investors and shareholders, to essentially put into defense as like, let's say a possible hedge or like experiment. So they're actually going out of their way right now and somehow are managing to work within this otherwise dead incentive system, basically. So that is the challenge on this first refrain that I want to sort of draw attention to, because it kind of, again, glosses over some of the historical reality. Refrain number 2, it's the individual psyche, not the state. So the idea here is that it's not the military or the government that's blocking private defense. It's the individual psyche. People want jobs handed to them, and and when they don't get those jobs, they shift the blame instead of building something themselves. So the issue with this is that, look, when we examine the reality of human nature, you can go to Pakistan, India, Canada, America, Britain, anywhere. The average person feels entitled to a job, feels entitled to affordable healthcare, if not free healthcare, is entitled to a good life. That's how they feel. And I think is valid. We lived in an era from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, where every generation had it better than the previous generation until recently. And it's not just a Pakistan problem, it's a global problem. Because globally, systemic issues are sort of preventing, let's say, the next generations from having as good or a better life than their previous generations. And this is very acute and obvious in Pakistan, right? The reality is that not everyone can get into the PAF or the armed forces or whatever. There's a finite number of seats. And not only that, but even amongst the people who retire out of the armed forces, not everyone can become a general or what have you. So most have to sort of get released from the armed forces. You need a vibrant private sector to absorb all these people, right? The state cannot be the one place where, as the person said, the state cannot provide. Not everyone can just get a job from the same source. So where are those jobs going to come from, right? It has to come from the private sector. And the discussion needs to shift into discussing looking at or examining the policies, systems, regulations that encourage private sector growth. So that's the approach. That's why I really want to steer the conversation away from the individual psyche. At the end of the day, every single person who is the average wants an easy life. You're not going to get from an individual who wants an easy life much. And this is a condition of every country. The ones who matter are the ones who are above the average, right? The ones who are special. And the question is, that if you're talking to a lot of Pakistanis and you're only coming across people who want jobs and an easy ticket, then where are the people who are the exceptional ones? And that's a concerning question, right? Why aren't they talking to you or anyone? Where have they gone? Well, I speak to a few of them, and those ones are telling me these are business owners. They already have functioning businesses in other industries. They're now moving laterally in defense. I'm basically providing some consulting to them. And they're coming out and saying that these are the problems that we're facing. Now, if I'm a policymaker and I want to grow the private sector, it behooves me as a leader to take the advice of the experts who are working in that domain. I'm not going to ask some civilian white collar worker about where to deploy Fatah 1 launchers in the field, right? I'm going to ask Army Rocket Force Command, right, or the Artillery Corps. Right? I'm going to go through that group of that domain. It's similar here that when people who are running businesses, who are trying to grow those businesses, who are trying to hire more, who want to hire more people. Like you said, that the refrain is like people are asking me to give them jobs and so on and so forth. These are people who would love to give people jobs. They would love to, but they need to grow their businesses, right? And there are certain policies and regulations which are absolutely blocking them. And that is the issue that we need to solve. So that's the one problem. Now, the specific example I want to sort of delve into here is something called no cost, no obligation, which I sort of alluded to earlier. And this is one of the policies that prevents the private sector from growing within the defense sector or defense industry. So basically, and I'll give you a few more, and I'll give you the drone examples from earlier. I'll give you a few more recent examples. So back in 2016, the Pakistan Army, and actually this is before 2016, I'll say 2014 or around 2014, the Pakistan Army had a requirement for these like wheeled armored fighting vehicles, like 8x8 AFVs, basically. And they looked around the world. They looked at some Chinese options. They looked at some Serbian options, even Turkish options. And in the midst of all this, a Pakistani company called Cavalier Group, they went out and designed their own 8x8. So they had their own original design. Obviously, it was when they built the prototype, they had limited means to be able to build a good prototype because, again, there was no R&D funding to access to do it, right? They had to pretty much bootstrap it. And being a Pakistani company, you don't have much to bootstrap with unless, I'll get to the later point, unless you're a bigger player. But with these engineering types of companies, it's kind of sad that engineering scientific companies don't have access to a lot of capital to begin with. And that's a structural systemic issue. But the point being is that they proposed their Hamza design. The army wasn't impressed with it, I guess. I don't know. But the point being is that at the end of the day, the issue was that even if they had come with a good design that met all the requirements, the army wasn't going to commit to any orders, and they had no funding to help them actually refine the design in the first place to make it a proper building. Like they didn't have the investment necessary to build dedicated tooling and all that kind of facility, basically a proper production facility for this vehicle, right? So you end up in a situation where they only had like a limited production run and they weren't able to really move the needle because of this kind of policy. I know folks would love to blame the company, but I don't blame them because I just look at the reality that they have to operate in. And this had like a downstream effect where some of the Army's other vehicle programs at the time. So they also, in 2017-ish, they had a 4x4 light armored vehicle program as well. And what some companies started doing, which is very funny, was that they basically, instead of even investing a dime in their own research and development, they would just go and sign like these partnership agreements with foreign companies like Kia or Eurovesta in Spain, and just sort of co-market their designs there. So they said, okay, like, there's no cost, no obligation, so we're not going to put any money down on the upfront design. We're just going to offer the Army a Spanish or Korean Humvee. And if the Army buys it, then that'll initiate the order process. And one of these companies even looped Heavy Industries Taxila into this whole scheme, basically just to try to sweeten their chances of it. Obviously, it didn't work out. So at the end of it all, the Army basically just told Heavy Industries Taxila to go and pick up a couple of design licenses. So HIT picked up the VN-22 license for the AFV program from China, and then the Chaiseri First Win license from Thailand. So this is the issue here. So now the problem with this whole thing is that we don't really know how many of these vehicles the Army plans to acquire, if they're going to intend to acquire many. So in some cases, these just might be licenses on paper. It seems like the Chaiseri, which is the Hussar mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, MRAP, will go into production to have an order of 100 units. But let's say Heavy Industries Taxila builds up the facilities for this, and the Army just stops at 100 units. So now we have this overhead for this MRAP that's just going to have to be sustained in perpetuity, because if we just let it die out, then we completely lose the expertise and the tooling and all that. I mean, the tooling might stay, but we lose the expertise and the people who are trained to manufacture this vehicle, right? And that is the concern here, basically. So, and then I'm sure HIT will try to basically market this vehicle for export and not really get that far because there's so many MRAP vehicles in the market anyways. This is a challenge here. And then for the 4x4 light armored vehicle, HIT is now offering their own Liger platform, which they've revealed recently. They probably used existing Chinese platform and basically up-armored it. So these are the issues that we face here, is that basically the state-owned enterprises using public money are able to go and produce these designs, whereas the private sector doesn't have access to those funds. And the thing is that you have not provided any incentive structure. So it's one thing to say, okay, the state won't fund any development. Okay, fair enough. But you should have at least an obligation to purchase from the private sector. And you might ask, why is that? Well, this goes into the nation-building mentality, right? It's not just about the immediate operational requirement. It's the operational requirement plus building the economy, expanding the economy, supporting jobs. Every country thinks like this, or every serious power thinks along these lines. Even Canada, if they're going through some problems with America, they're basically willing to walk away from the F-35 and go and consider the Gripen. Like, imagine the change of focus. You go from that to that, right? This is how serious countries operate, right? They think about how they can channel a massive fiscal line item, which is defense. It could be Pakistan's biggest fiscal line item for all we know. How do you channel it across the domestic economy so that it works as a stimulus, not a drain, right? Because if it works as a stimulus, it'll help grow other parts of those economies. So, for example, if the army commits to ordering, let's say, 300 MRAPs from the first Pakistani company that develops its own design. So let's say the army says you have to meet a certain standard, and that private company will now pour in all the resources to reach that standard. Now you might ask, how would they do it? Well, this is where the private company will say, look, the order potential could be around, give or take, $1 billion, including support. So that's the return on investment. So they'll say, what? In this MRAP vehicle, we will spend maybe 15, 20 million on R&D. We will spend another 50 million on the production line. We might spend another 50 million on maybe indigenizing some of the critical inputs so we can reduce the cost. So they'll need to have an overhead of maybe $250 million, right? However, the contract itself would be worth like $1 billion. So let's say you factor in the cost of the units and what have you. So maybe at the end of the $1 billion, you can get like someone to really toss the numbers here correctly, but the framework is accurate. But at the end of the $1 billion, they'll break even. So meaning that at the end of the $1 billion, they'll recoup all their costs. So now they have this facility, it's functioning, and the cost of every MRAP after the Army's 250, 300 units is now at the cost of the labor and the materials. Not only that, but many of the materials are being sourced from within Pakistan, so the cost is now even lower. But the same company can go out to the export market and say, yes, we offer an MRAP, which is like 20, 30, 40% cheaper than the standard Western competitor because we have Pakistani labor and we use Pakistani-made components to about 50% valuation of the system. So maybe everything except the engine, we actually source and manufacture within Pakistan, or maybe they somehow managed to build the engine in Pakistan as well. Maybe they put in the money like Alson's group is towards pistons and combustion, and they figure that part too, right? So these things, this is how the private sector mechanism works. And now this private company is going out generating exports because they're very profit loss oriented. They're taking marketing extremely seriously. They're going out there, building connections and getting this MRAP in the hands of more people. Their supply chain keeps expanding. They have more customers to support, and they use the Pakistan Army as their story of it being proven and all this and that. That's the alternative, as opposed to what we have right now with HIT and Pakistan's SOEs in general, is where they have these designs, they provide to the local domestic market base, and then whatever is like kind of left over, whatever the excesses, they provided for export. So there's no incentive structure to drive the exports forward, right? There's no incentive structure to expand and build forward, because here's the other thing: when the investor is the public, when the investor is the state's only going to spend just enough to keep the minimal viable production capability for what they need for their induction, so for their own programs. So that's why the J-17 line, the assembly line, is capped at, let's say, 24 aircraft per year in PAC, not 48. It's because that is exactly the max the PF is willing to support. Whereas, let's say if you had a private sector assembly line, and obviously it might not map out just given the nature of the J-17 and the indigenization aspect in Pakistan, but let's say you started this program in 1979, you had more lead time, and you gave the domestic industry more time to sort of catch up and produce things like alloys and what have you. Then at that point, the private sector might say, hey, like, the demand for this kind of fighter could be actually 24 aircraft domestically and 24 aircraft overseas. So let's open up a second assembly line. So this is how these things sort of shake out. Obviously, with aerospace, it's a bit trickier, but definitely for things like armored vehicles, assault rifles, small, these like all these hyperscale or mega scale sort of products, it's inexcusable that we're bottlenecked by one or two supply channels for this stuff, when the market for them is like practically endless. Right? Especially like firearms, bullets, and that kind of stuff. It's like inexcusable. But that's the result of having a SOE-led industry approach. And don't get me wrong, I'm a supporter of state-owned enterprises. But the way I sort of frame it is that you need state-owned enterprises for the types of areas where there's no way the private sector is going to be able to do anything, right? For one reason or the other. So these could be things like hyperscale products. So this, for example, fiber optic cables. So you have all these private Pakistani companies are getting into like FPV drones, loitering munitions, and all that kind of stuff. Well, here's the thing, right? All these different companies are going to need fiber optics, especially for the FPV drones and basically hardwire connected drones, or they call them electronic warfare resistant drones, basically. Who's going to manufacture that many fiber optics cables every day, right? Who could do that in Pakistan? There's no private company that could do that. Not right now. So that's where you bring in the public sector, the state-owned enterprises to go and deal with these hyperscale situations, or like, for example, solid rocket motor fuel. So you have private Pakistani companies saying, and Wootech has proved it. Wootech, recently tested a rocket motor for small factor drones and loitering munitions. So I spoke to another company and they said they have research of their own that they can make their own rocket motors as well. And there are others who are willing to look into it as well if they had, like, let's say, the incentive structure. But if all these companies start making rocket motors, someone has to provide the rocket fuel, right? That's where, again, the hyperscale, the SOEs come in. And this is where it's perfectly fine to be a loss leader, because then the SOEs can make the fuel, the upstream inputs, like the plastic molds and all this kind of stuff, very, very, very cheaply using the state's resources. And then as a result, the private sector benefits, because here's what gets interesting. The private sector can use these subsidized or low-cost inputs and then really make their export solutions way more competitive. So then they start getting market share in overseas markets. This is sort of how China operates as well. So this is the point we're trying to make here. So it's not just, and then so there's some of these critical industries or like critical sectors like nuclear, where again, you're not going to expect the private sector to do anything without a very strong public sector support base. And this is where you need PAC. So there are those kind of sectors. But when we're talking about like loitering munitions, I think like, or interceptor drones, like come on, right? Why is heavy industries Taxila getting into interceptor drones when there's at least 3 to 5 other Pakistani companies already doing it? In fact, there's one Pakistani company, Gradient Aerospace, which is basically developing a solution map to map or one-to-one map to how the Ukrainian sky map system works. So they built basically a system where there's a kinetic interceptor drone plus the encrypted data links plus the system software layer essentially allows these systems to sort of use a mix of different sensors like acoustic sensors, radar sensors, passive sensors like electronic support measure systems to basically pick up drone activity and then automatically send the interceptor drones to pursue them. So you kind of reduce the human input right until the end. So you drop the human right at the end of the control chain and then they take it home from there, if at all. And they seem to be working towards something that can go fully autonomous. That's where this company is working in. And now you have heavy industries Taxila doing the same thing. Why? And why is heavy industries Taxila doing this when they're the armored vehicle company? Shouldn't they be focused on making the MRAPs more efficient in cost? Shouldn't they be focused on making the Haider more affordable for the army, so the army is not stuck at 178 tanks? These are the kind of questions we're talking about here. So when people complain about the government or the state not providing support to the private sector, this is where the discussion really sits. It's not on these individuals like complaining. I think that's a very reductive perspective that sort of skips out a lot of the policy nuances of the situation. So refrain number 3, investors and the youth won't sacrifice. So the idea here is that the investors and young people, they don't want to sacrifice, unlike Bezos or Musk in their early grind years. So the first thing is, look, if you look into the history of Elon Musk, you'll know that he greatly benefited from state support in the US. SpaceX had received both early development funding from the US government and it also received a consistent stream of orders to the point where NASA was sort of put in the back burner and made more of an R&D organization. For example, that's in the case of SpaceX. And then that helped Musk sort of buoy his other investments like the Boring Company and Tesla. So the point is that Musk actually does, and you can just Google search this, you can look through the media and so on. You can look through a lot of documentation for places like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Musk owes his fortunes to the state. And that's a fact of it, right? SpaceX was built both from its nucleus in terms of the initial R&D funding. So the US government came in instead of no cost, the US government said, hey, we will co-fund the development of your systems. And instead of no obligation, the US government committed to taking up orders, right, to use SpaceX initially. And then SpaceX was able to build and scale upon that. And that was the basis at which SpaceX was able to develop. I invite you to look into it. And it's very similar to what Skyroot India is going to be doing, I'm sure. It's very similar to what Chinese companies do. It's very similar to what European companies are doing. So this idea that like there's a grind aspect involved, it's a bit of I think it's a bit misleading. Truly, yes, people do grind. But the ones who grind, frankly, are not the businessmen or even the investors. The ones who grind are the engineers who have to stay and work day in, day out, right? It's the engineers, for example, who develop Pakistan's nuclear science and weapons research and the entire nuclear fuel cycle. They were the ones, no matter how much they were paid, that's irrelevant. They were the ones who were grinding to get it done because they believed in a vision and they were organized under a structure that sort of drove them towards that vision and kind of removed the blockers, including the policy blockers. So this is an important point. And it's not just like the Pakistan nuclear program. I'll give you more examples like that are maybe more comparable. So how we sort of put a pillow over our drone industry in the late 90s and early 2000s, like SATUMA and Integrated Dynamics, we sort of put a pillow over them and I don't know if they're moving or not. It's like you see a corpse sit there and it's just kind of staying still. But in Turkey, there was a company called Baykar Group. So Baykar Group was very similar in size and capability to SATUMA and Integrated Dynamics. And what Baykar Group, what happened was in the early 2000s, the Turkish government established an entity now it's called the Presidency of Defense Industries, the SSB. So think of it's like MOD, the MODP, but on steroids, basically. And the SSB basically set a requirement for a medium altitude long endurance drone that had to meet certain parameters set by the Turkish military. And basically, they awarded the R&D funding, or rather they committed to orders. So they said whichever Turkish company can develop the solution will commit to buying X 100, 200 units. So basically, Baykar Group was able to summon the private capital to invest in the Bayraktar TB2, same TB2 that the Pakistan Air Force operates, despite there being a Shepard 2. Just putting it out there. But the point being is that Bayraktar, the Baykar Group, was able to summon the private capital to develop the TB2. And the TB2 had problems in the beginning, but they're able to improve upon it pretty rapidly, and then they're able to put it to production. The reason why the private capital came, the reason why the Turkish SETs, for example, and these other big money people put money into Baykar was because the Turkish government had committed orders. So there's the obligation side. Then another example is that if you look at India, so India does a lot of emphasis on the cost side. So India might not commit to the orders, but they'll commit on the first part. So there's it's like the Make India framework, where the state basically promises to fund up to 70% of the prototype development for strategically important and technologically difficult systems. So this is where things like composites, alloys, rocket motors, turbojet engines, like all this kind of like different strategically important inputs, the state will fund the prototype R&D to up to 70%. So they'll share in that, right? And then if it meets the requirement, the Indian armed forces will basically buy it. We kind of hear the stories of them not working out a lot. Like sometimes, time to time, I think they're kind of overblown, to be fair. But the point being is that this is how the Indian industry is able to go. So you have these two examples where the Turks definitely promise on the commitment side, and the Indians definitely promise on the cost for R&D side. And in Pakistan, unfortunately, we commit to neither. And that is why Turkey has a Baykar group, and we do not have a Baykar group. Right? That is why India has indigenized so many different components and inputs, whereas we are still importing our alloys and stuff for the JF-17. Right? And that's the issue here. So this goes into the point that the person made regarding, or the refrain that Pakistanis won't sacrifice. And I think that is so, unfortunately, it overlooks so much history. Because right in 1947, there are people who migrated to Pakistan, right? Including my forefathers, right? We were big time landlords in Hyderabad, Deccan, right? And this, actually, I'm not even sure if we liquidated any property. I think they just got appropriated or something, because India took over Hyderabad. So I don't think we even had much to begin with. But my great uncle, he came to Pakistan, and he basically, whatever capital he had, he invested. Cement company, he had a construction company and everything. And he was reliant under a chain of people who would kind of connect back to the 22 big industrial families. So like what happened was there were these 22 families, both within what is today Pakistan, both from the outside, who came from India, basically. And these 22 families are like the big national champions of the industry, right? They're the big industrialists. And the thing was that these industrialists then had subcontractors, and the subcontractors had subcontractors. So my great uncle was like maybe like the second link. So you'd be the subcontractor right under the big industrialist company. So there was a time where even within Karachi, a lot of the buildings up till the 70s were actually built by our company, basically, or our family company. So the point being is that what happened was that when nationalization hit, those 22 families, they lost all their properties that they had invested and developed within Pakistan. So this was a policy decision that destroyed the individual Pakistani sacrifice, destroyed it. And with it created so many downstream problems where businesses like that of my great uncle and many, many others, like hundreds and hundreds of businesses, were suffering, because all of a sudden now the company that they were working with, which was a private sector industrial company, suddenly got nationalized, right? It became the Pakistan ABCD, whatever it is, Pakistan Heavy Machines Complex or whatever, Pakistan Engineering Corporation. And suddenly this state-owned corporation, what will it do? Well, either it'll give contracts to whoever was connected to the bureaucrat or the politician in charge of that, or it would go and set up some smaller state-owned entity and give it to like, some 4G Industries entity for cement or something, as opposed to my great uncle's company. And this was the issue. This was the problem. So then a lot of these small to medium-sized mid-market companies basically collapsed under the nationalization. That's very devastating for Pakistan. Like, I can tell you that we used to probably hire people within interior Sindh even, and now we couldn't. And I remember hearing that those people were like crying in tears, basically, at what the loss was. So this is the effect of policy, especially negative policy. And I have like another challenge on top of this is that we still haven't given back to the private sector for this. We still haven't repaid the private sector in earnest. What I mean by that is this is where something like we ask the question, well, why should the armed forces feel obligated, or why should the state feel obligated to buy from the private sector? It's to make up for the nationalization. It's to make up for this. So it kind of goes back full circle, right? So there are people who took enormous risk to set up industries within Pakistan, and they were just basically cut from the knees and had all their property sort of appropriated by the state. And the state gave them, offered to give them back shoddier properties, which were not as efficient anymore. Many of those people left Pakistan with their capital, right? I know people who I have extended, I would say like through friends and stuff, extended I don't know, like people who we know, acquaintances, I guess, who had medical equipment manufacturing companies. They moved to they moved to Abu Dhabi because the steel mills, they provide subsidized energy, and the forging steel there is way cheaper than it is in Pakistan, right? Whereas they used to be able to export that same equipment out of Pakistan to the UAE once upon a time, right? So this is a point is where the obligation is actually there from a moral standpoint as well. And if you do that, like if you sort of close the loop on that negative relationship, then you also give private capital an incentive to come back, because you're signaling to private capital that, hey, the state has changed. The state wants to help the domestic industry, right? Whereas what is happening right now is when I look at the Baykar group, I mean no disrespect to them at all. I actually hope the PAF acquires the Bayraktar UAV, but it's like we are essentially taking public money and giving it to the private companies of other countries who did what we were supposed to do, while we deny the same opportunity to our own people. And this is so wrong, right? This is not correct. So before we start dumping on the individual psyche and make the individual Pakistani like some poor 19, 20-year-old lower middle class kid who's just trying to get a job so he can ask that girl he likes to marry him. Before we get to that, let's like evaluate the bigger policies and systems that are creating the situation that caused this guy to go and must for jobs, basically. That's my perspective here. And I think that's where we should sort of hold it at and stop blaming the people over and over again for this kind of stuff. Really, as I said, 80% of the responsibility falls on the systems and the individual decision makers who have access to the resources and the capacity to make real change. The 20% that falls on people like us or average normal people is for them to actually keep holding the system accountable, to keep talking about these things, to keep quote unquote complaining. Now, when they complain, it's ideally they should be more informed and come up with more examples and read their history and have a vision of what the solution should look like, 100%. But that is their actual job, that's what accountability looks like, right? So that's the point I want to sort of deliver on that front. And then there's this refrain here about this idea that no one in Pakistan was able to provide screws and rivets for the JF-17. So let's assume that is true. And I think there's a lot of information that's probably missing in that statement that the person who said this wasn't privy to. Let's say that's true. I would argue that's a colossal structural failing. Here's why. So let's say PAC needed, aerospace quality screws and rivets, for example. Fair enough. They need it at a certain spec. There's one of three options here. Option one, you ask the private sector, hey, can anyone make these rivets? And they all come back and say, no, we can't. Okay, so option two is we need to build the capacity in Pakistan. So there are two ways of doing this. Option one is that we do what we just basically probably did, is that we set up a small little JF-17 rivet production facility within PAC. Again, cutting-edge aerospace company has been reduced to also manufacturing rivets and screws. Fair enough. That's option one. But option two could have been the PAC, Pakistan Air Force, the state, to go back to the private sector and say, look, we want to invest 5, 10 million, whatever. I don't think the CNCs for this would have cost much. But let's say, for argument's sake, just get a good round number here. We're going to invest $10 million in aerospace quality screws and rivets production. We want the private sector to come in and invest with us, or we'll invest in a private company, but with some conditions. So let's say we invest PAC, we invest wholesale into a private company. We're going to hold you accountable to profit and loss. So obviously you have an order for 200 domestic JF-17s, but you're going to need to show us a business plan and a proposal that will allow you to scale and take this investment and create an ROI of, let's say, $100 million. So we put in 10 million, we want 100 million out of this. I would guarantee you that if a $10 million investment plan was on the line, the private sector will come back and show you how they can do it. So this private sector company might say, yes, we'll build a factory and everything for 5 million, and then we'll commit to the $5 million order for PAC. And then using this facility, we're going to go and re-export these screws and rivets to like all these small, medium, let's say small aviation and aircraft manufacturing companies all over the world. We've established supplier partnerships with these companies like in Germany, Poland, Ukraine, whatever. We got a deal in the works with the Turkish company for their trainers, like whatever. Like this is how these things operate. And they say that we can get you an ROI of 100 million. So through this model, PAC is like, okay, we'll invest 5 million for 50%. You handle the other 5 million. And then when this company starts generating the ROIs, PAC is now left with two options. They can keep their equity and keep earning dividends off it, which is something which the Turkish industry does for the Turkish government, or they can sell their equity. So they can say, look, this little venture of screws and rivets that we have here, they're making a profit of about 2 million a year, 3 million like net profit. We're willing to sell it for 30, 40, 50 million. Well, we're willing to sell it for, let's say, 20 million, just to be realistic here, somewhat realistic. So the PAC comes out of this as a net gainer. They get the screws and rivets and they get some money out of it. So the question is, why didn't this happen? Why did the screws and rivets, why did PAC expand its capacity again to deal with screws and rivets? And this is the question that we're asking. Like, how are we getting to these sorts of arbitrary expansionary decisions where the state just keeps doing more and more and more and more of the work and never really co-invests or does equity share or true public-private partnerships with the private sector? Why is that a recurring trend and issue? And then on the other side of it, I think there are a lot of gaps in this framing. And the gaps is on the fact that, look, Pakistan has basically indigenized and developed its own nuclear fuel cycle. So it's indigenized the entire nuclear fuel cycle. So obviously, and PAC itself is PAC, which is the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, supplies radiation shielding equipment to CERN in Switzerland. You can look it up. So clearly there is some advanced engineering capability that can develop these screws and rivets existing in Pakistan somewhere. These engineers and scientists clearly exist, because if I think about Pakistan's nuclear program, PAC is a big player, but it also then delegates downwards to both public sector and private sector companies. So one of them is Descon, which is a very big multinational private sector company. They're involved in construction. So clearly the knowledge to do freaking JF-17 rivets and screws exists somewhere. It could just be that the folks who are responsible for dealing with this didn't do a good enough job finding it, right? And then also, if you speak to heavy industries Taxila, you'll also know they have their own in-house R&D bureau called ARDIC. And what this entity does is that it reverse engineers components of tanks and vehicles and then actually licenses out the designs to the private sector to build on. So 39% of the Haider main battle tank has been indigenized. And I would say maybe 15 to 20 percentage points of that, so around half of that, actually is sourced from the private sector through upstream components, which includes things like tracks, certain kinds of gears, certain kinds of motor and cog equipments, certain kinds of composites and what have you. So the point being is that clearly this exists somewhere, right? You just can't say that people are just so dumb in Pakistan, right? That they're able to make a nuclear fuel cycle program on one hand and maintain it and continue it and expand it, right? And they can't make screws and rivets with JF-17, right? That doesn't math, right? So clearly there's a structural failing here where the people responsible for deciding who gets to build these screws and rivets didn't do their due diligence, right? And this is, again, an accountability question, right? This is, again, a question of why weren't certain decisions made and why were other decisions made. So, for example, India has a Comptroller Auditor General, CAG, that basically is on the asses of the Indian armed forces, the Indian government on these issues. They would have asked this question. In fact, they would have, had there been a true empowered Pakistan equivalent of the CAG, they would have said, so PAC claims that there was no company that could have made rivets and screws for the JF-17, and they went and spent $1 million on a facility to do it. Well, we looked around and we found two companies who could do it. One of them is Alston's group, or one of them is this group, or one of them is that group, and they offered to do it, and so on and so forth, right? And they would have held the decision makers accountable, right? And this is how these things are supposed to work. Forget democracy, man. This is how it works in a competent country. Like, this is how it works in China. This is how it works in Russia. This is how it works in North Korea, man, right? How is Pakistan at least not reaching that level, right? It's truly a competency question here at this point, right? And there needs to be some accountability mechanism. It could be from within the system or whatever, to make sure that the North Star is that Pakistan grows, Pakistan becomes strong, that we start being able to exert our national interests both within and outside of our borders. If that's the North Star, then everybody needs to align on that. And then that becomes the reference point of every single decision. Whether you're a democracy, whether you're a dictatorship, whether you're a monarchy, doesn't matter. This is how real independent countries are supposed to operate. right? And this is not the level we're seeing in Pakistan. We're seeing what I would say a lot of talking from the people who have decision-making authority and not a lot of showing. And that is the unfortunate reality here. So refrain number 4, both sides are at fault. So decision makers are comfortable with the status quo and worried about NOC, so non-objective clause misuse, but the private sector won't put in the years to build credibility. So I think we've sort of unpacked this over the preceding points here. However, again, I'll give you an emphasis here. There are private Pakistani companies, for example, that have been working on interceptor drones. There's one I'm not going to name for the sake of security purposes, but there's one that works closely with the Pakistan Army at the mid layer on basically testing these drones because they don't have access to testing grounds and other facilities to do it above water, and they're getting direct feedback from the Pakistan Army's middle units, you could say field units, on this to whether this translates over into a true, whether this translates into orders or not, I'm not sure, because now you have heavy industries Taxila going around making its own interceptor drone. It has like all this state money that it can use. It has access to the testing facilities. It has access to the unrestricted control parameters that the private sector companies cannot operate in. So I don't know who's going to win, but I can tell you that the private sector company, or just the private sector companies I've seen and spoken to, they're definitely doing the job. They're definitely showing that they're able to produce these solutions, right? But the issue is that it's on the state side that's not not supporting them. It's creating structural situations that is competing against these private players. And honest to God, I would not be surprised if at least one of these private companies ends up in Canada or the UK. They're probably very close to that at this point, because those countries will gladly invest that know-how and capability and absorb it into their own systems. And that would be a drain on that would be a loss for Pakistan. But that's a loss that unfortunately we have seen 1, 2, 3, 4 many times at this point. So refrain number 5, grand policy wish lists. So the issue here is basically people on forums, Twitter, X, whatever, Quwa's Defense Uncut podcast. No, just joking. Hopefully not. But people propose grand wish lists that Pakistan should be making its own metallurgy industry, turbine blade factories. Pakistan steel mills should be making engine components. And the argument is that that's all impractical because the government isn't interested. So why even talk about it? So let me just break the question down. The government is not interested, so why talk about it? What is the point? So let me take you to a hotel room in London. And we're not going there, guys, don't worry. But on 11th December 1965, at the Dorchester Hotel, Dr. Munir Ahmed Khan, basically he was working at the International Atomic Energy Agency. He was able to get a meeting through Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was able to get a meeting with Field Marshal Ayub Khan. It was the first time they met. And basically Dr. Munir Khan basically explains to Ayub Khan that through certain mechanisms and investment, Pakistan can develop the entire nuclear fuel cycle indigenously. All it has to do is go to the open market, acquire some readily available facilities and systems, and then train the workforce on how to construct those things and basically then duplicate it in Pakistan so that Pakistan would be prepared, if need be, to develop the bomb. And Ayub Khan asks him, look, point blank to Munir Khan, can you make the bomb? And Dr. Munir Khan, basically, Munir Ahmed Khan, I keep like messing that name up. Dr. Munir Ahmed Khan, he basically says, look, I cannot make the bomb, but a team can, and I think it can be done. And then then basically General Ayub Khan asks him, like, what do you need for this to happen? And Munir Khan basically says, we have to go to the commercial market. We have to spend around $150 million. Then we can get the entire fuel cycle here. And Ayub Khan basically, to his credit, was patient, but he said to Dr. Munir Khan, and I quote, Pakistan is too poor a country to afford such luxuries. If we ever needed the bomb, we can get it off the shelf. And now I ask you, the government back then wasn't interested in the nuclear weapon or the nuclear fuel cycle. Does that justify not talking about it? Does that justify not having a vision for it? Does that justify just moving on from the topic and being quote unquote realistic? And here's where I want to stress another point, because Dr. Munir Khan, this time he brought in Dr. Abdul Salam. So they basically submitted a joint written proposal to Ayub Khan in 1967, listing out exactly how, like piece by piece, how they would get to the nuclear weapon, how they would develop the entire nuclear fuel cycle in Pakistan, everything from end to end. And it would cost $150 million or less to build. At that time, there was no major restrictions on this stuff compared to what happened in 74. And basically, when Dr. Abdul Salam basically followed up with President Ayub Khan said that he saw it and passed it to his finance secretary, Ghulam Ishaq Khan. And Mr. Ghulam Ishaq Khan basically said no to funding it. And basically the bureaucracy around them, these guys, they weren't interested in pursuing this option at all. So again, the refrain was the government twice, 65 and 67 said no to the nuclear option, none. Did that mean it was not worth talking about? Because those nuclear nationalists kept talking about it. They kept talking about it. They kept talking about it in the lead up to 71. They kept talking about it in 72. They kept talking about it in 73. And then they kept talking about it in 74. And the last time they talked about it was in a meeting with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who asked them, can we do it? And how can we do it? And that's when they got the approval. So if this is the refrain, then we need to completely put it to the side, because what the government might think at any given point is not the reference point. The reference point is national interest. See, this is again how a country, an independent country, is supposed to think. And when we are studying public policy in places like Canada, the US and stuff, we actually think in terms of national vital interests. So there's national interests and then there's vital interests. And a vital interest is something that's supposed to sort of cut across every party, every group, every partisan opinion, what have you. It's supposed to cut across everything. It's supposed to be the pillar that keeps the country standing. It's supposed to be the pillar that ensures that no matter who's in charge, that the country will keep moving along, keep growing, keep becoming more powerful, and keep providing prosperity to its people, right? And sometimes the policies that manifest from these vital interests might differ. So the way, for example, Trump interprets these vital interests, or the way the Republicans interpret these vital interests, will be different from the way Democrats interpret them. But they agree on the vital interests. So for example, how they deal with China has been different, Democrats versus the Republicans. But they both have a problem with China, right? How they deal with securing supply chains is different, but they both want to secure supply chains, right? How they deal with, even for example, India, right? It can be different, but they both want to engage India, right? So the point is that as a country, when and again, you'll notice the string that keeps going, the string that we keep pulling on is the string of systems, structures, institutions, laws, things that the average guy who's looking for an internship or a paid internship, or you're telling to go out to the farmhouse to go build a drone academy. This is not their world. This is the world of the people who make decisions. And yes, we have to be on their butts about this, because the decisions they make or don't make can have catastrophic consequences. They can have catastrophic consequences. Like if in 65, Pakistan had actioned the nuclear fuel cycle program, potentially the majority of it could have been constructed by before 71, and Pakistan could have been in a situation where they could just even threaten having an inert nuclear weapon, and that could have had an impact on 71. Who knows? Maybe not, but it would have been a card that they could have played, which it didn't have. And we want to give Pakistan today as many cards it can play. So when the vision comes for having a metallurgy industry, it's not about chest thumping. It's about having these critical high value industries, which can not only support our defense requirements, but can help drive high value exports, right? That can help integrate our output to some of the more advanced sectors. Like maybe we should just move on from trying to do textiles and stuff and get into the area of building the machines that do textiles. So the textile factory equipment, basically, stitchers or whatever equipment they use, basically. Maybe we want to get into researching different sorts of materials for both clothing as well as non-clothing applications, let's say solid applications like boats and for ships and boats and stuff. Maybe we want to, the point being is that we want to just get into more advanced sectors, basically. And this is how it manifests. And these are the areas where you want to reserve the public funding for, because these are the areas where it will be very hard to make profitable. These are the areas in general the private sector will not be able to support. However, the private sector will be your number one customer. So for example, if we had a Pakistani state-owned, let's say, propulsion agency, let's call them the Baloch Engine Systems Production Agency, like BESPA. Already came up with the name, trademark, cool. But anyways, let's suppose you had BESPA chilling around and you tell BESPA, we are going to give you a sustained stream of funding, 100 million every year to go and do R&D and production on gas turbines. And you're going to gradually get to that point. It might, when you speak to a scientist and engineer, this is also very important. It's very interesting because I've spoken to a lot of them, maybe 100 from around the world. And I always ask two questions. So if I speak to a Pakistani engineer, Asim, for example, he's a PhD in flight controls technology. So he's our co-host on Pulse Check. If I ask him, can Pakistan make X? That's question number one. He'll say 99% of the time, he'll say no right away. Before I even ask the question, I say, can Pakistan make? He'll say no. But anyways, after that question, I ask him, how long would it take? And an engineer or a scientist, without fail, and I'm not even kidding, this is amazing, without fail, will give you a timeline. The timeline will either be very long, it'll be medium, or it'll be short. But the point is that where there's a will, there's always a way. And that's how these engineers and scientists think. And this is how the nuclear people used to think, right? They all started their nuclear studies back in the early 50s, all these scientists and engineers. And they were by 74, they were all the senior management of the eventual Pakistan nuclear program, right? So they were thinking in terms of timelines. So it's very similar with things like gas turbines. It's never a question of, will we ever get there? The question is when and how long and what would the funding look like? So basically, you can go to a Best Buy, you can set up Best Buy, you can get a few of the best Pakistani metallurgists and gas turbine engineers from around the world. You pay them good dollars, or you give them a respectable life where they have some dignity and they don't have to deal with refrain addicts. But you basically ask them, how long will it take? And they'll say, okay, for a miniature turbojet, a miniature turbofan that's meant to be expendable, we can maybe make one in 5 years. This is how we're going to do it. But if you're talking about like a JF-17 class, D93 class engine, that's going to take us 30 years unless we get help. Okay. And then you ask, who can help us? They'll say it's a control technology. It's going to be hard, but we might be able to learn different aspects of it from different places. So we might be able to learn maybe the control side of it from Ukraine. We might be able to learn the fuel management side of it from China. We might be able to learn some other parts of it from the West. We might be able to enter into a joint venture with Turkey to develop the blades. Because Turkey, they want to develop the engines as well, and they know it's a high capital, high cost, high skill endeavor. So we can co-fund into their project, send our engineers there, and they can learn from them. And then we can maybe teach them or maybe glue them in on what we're doing on our end. And then, or maybe we have like a more meta level exchange that we can help accelerate their nuclear program in exchange for accessing their gas turbine aerospace programs, right? And then you get to those outcomes and then you have those timelines. Now imagine, you might say, well, 30 years is so long, Bilal. Well, how long 30 years ago was for us? It was what, 1996? 1996. That's how long. I mean, I'm sure some of you who might be listening to this, it might just seem like a flash. And many of you might not have been born in 1996, which is fair enough. But that's how long. 30 years ago wasn't that long. If we had started then, we could have it might have been a clunker. It might not have been great. We could have had a prototype functional engine whose research and development we then spin off into different projects and keep revisiting gradually until we get it right. It's doable. This is the point. So the government not being interested is never the reference point. So just to round out the discussion here, this idea that if the government's not interested in something, therefore there's no point in discussing it, I think this is a very erroneous perspective because it doesn't even align with the foundations of the country. Like there's a time where you could argue that the British Raj wasn't interested in Pakistan or dividing South Asia into two parts. Does that make the existence of Pakistan any less valid? No. There's a time where the Pakistani government was not interested in the nuclear option. Did that make the nuclear option any less valid? No. So the point is that if your vital interests are sovereignty and ensuring your national survival and these things, then you would want to focus on the industries that enable that. And these critical industries like metallurgy, gas turbine, and what have you, they require SOEs to drive them, right? However, the outcome is that number one, they help solidify Pakistan, make us less dependent on external powers. But on the other hand, it becomes like a critical resource for the private sector. So here's what I mean. If you have going back to our Best Buy example, you have your Balochistan Engine Systems Production Agency. And they're going around making miniature turbojet engines, for example, or maybe they're making let's say 10 kN, 15 kN turbofan engines, right, for UCAV applications. Suddenly, your Pakistani private sector companies have access to a domestic UCAV engine design without the same controls as Western designs that they can use, they can buy, they can incorporate into their own designs. So you have these downstream effects that come from that. Obviously, that's a simplistic example, but you could apply it across maybe the forging systems that you have for steel, the alloy R&D. For example, you might invest organically in some certain types of alloy properties and stuff, and then you develop the IP for it. And now your private Pakistani companies can go and access that as part of their programs for whatever reason. So there's many countless examples of it. And this is how a company like Skyroot in India was able to emerge. This was the environment that they were able to emerge out of, right? Because the government had created, its national champions had been investing and building these critical properties, these critical industries, right? That was available to the private sector in India to then incorporate and leverage into their own programs. And this is how you get there. And this is the sort of perspective that we need to have, right? And again, it goes back, we keep pulling the same strings, right? This is something that, again, it deals with policymakers, it deals with systems, it deals with laws, it deals with institutions, it deals with things that Bichara Ahmed guy who wants a paid internship in the hopes of one day getting a paid job, in the hopes of asking Uncle Ahmed whoever that guy is, for his daughter's hand in marriage. Like this guy is not the guy who's going to who's going to worry about this stuff, right? It's the people who have access to the state, right, to the resources, who are the ones who decide the allocations and stuff. They are accountable. They are definitely accountable, and this is where we need to sort of shift, not the blame, but to shift the weight towards, right? We have to establish that these are the people who own 80% of the accountability, and the 20%, the rest of us, the accountability that we're responsible for, is to push that narrative, basically. So, all right. So let me just land all this somewhere constructive, because I just don't want to be critic. So here's my proposal for a modest, concrete starting point. A simple mechanism. I think the state, through the armed forces, should set up $100 million venture fund annually, not a grant program, but a venture fund. So with the venture fund, they can publish a indigenization and domestic sourcing plan, staged from the most simplest, immediate low-hanging fruit to the most complex procurement requirements over, let's say, decades. So you start at the first 5 years and then you plan this out for the next 50 years. And against that plan, we would want the state to invest $100 million every year, right? So over 10 years, say that's $1 billion. Let's say it doesn't grow, it stays static, right? So that's $5 billion in just pure venture capital going out. And the whole point is that you're basically going to solve the cost side of the equation. So you say you wanted to secure some rivets and screws for the JF-17, you start there. But to be frank, the private sector is definitely capable of more. Let's say you want to do some interceptor drones. You have a procurement plan for about, let's say, 200,000 interceptor drones, right? You tell the private sector, look, we will invest $10 million into design, development, and production of these drones. You're responsible now. We're figuring out how to get us from A to B, right? And the whole point is that you hold these guys accountable to make sure they reach their own milestones according to the venture capital terms. And in return, the armed forces get to own an equity stake within these private sector companies. Because you receive public funding, the state reserves the right to have equity within these private companies. It wouldn't be majority. The private companies would still have wield the authority, but the state has a benefit of basically over time, as these private companies both recoup their costs through domestic orders, they can then start exporting, right, and generate profit. The state will have an opportunity to basically get some dividends off that profit over a whatever period the state believes that it wants to use. And then these equity ownerships sort of become like a leverage point that the state can go back to, for example, to Turkish companies and say, look, we want offsets with our, let's say we want to buy this is just an example. It's not necessarily going to happen. But let's say we want to buy the Khan fighter. We want to buy 150 units. I mean, just throwing out numbers here. Let's say we want to buy 90 units, but we want 100% offset. Okay, that's a big ask. It's not simple for the Turkish industry. However, the fact is you might have maybe over a period of time equity ownership in private sector companies worth 10, 15, 20 billion dollars. And the Turkish companies can say, what? We can buy that off you in exchange for the Khan, for example. Now, obviously, if you have all this equity ownership in all these little companies or these small, medium, mid-market companies, maybe some enterprise companies, you'll probably be generating a pretty healthy annual return from it, which you can then route to a sovereign wealth fund, or you can then reuse as part of your fiscal exchequer. You can maybe put towards pensions. It's up to you, but you have assets, right? And it's a win-win sort of situation. Definitely there's risks involved in this in the sense of, again, you're sort of choosing winners and losers, but I think it takes a lot of the friction out of the way and helps private sector companies grow. So this is where, for example, returning back to Bichara Ahmed, who wants an internship. He's looking for an internship. The government has this $100 million venture fund every year. The government happens to fund, let's say, 10 to 20 different companies. These companies are now on a hiring spree. They've gotten the venture capital from the government. They now are able to go to private sector companies and say, hey, look, they're able to go to private investors and say, hey, look, the government is paying us 50% on this project. We're going to provide, and they've committed to certain orders. We're going to provide them these orders. We need to be able to develop this solution at these standards. We're going to need more capital from you. And the private sector is like, okay, what's the return on investment? They'll say 200,000 interceptor drones. Okay, now the private capital goes in. These companies start hiring. Ahmed can get his internship. No problem. Ahmed and his future wife can both get the internship. They can both work together. So, I mean, and even their dads can work in the company. Like for all, I don't know, like whatever. There'll be jobs. This is how we operate. So this is the perspective I just wanted to sort of throw here. And again, I might have simplified some aspects of it because it's sort of it's supposed to be a quick take and end up being like an hour long, basically an hour long monologue. But I'll leave it at that. However, I do want to call out that on Quwa website, so quwa.org, I did publish an article on one of the policy mechanisms that I discussed here, which was the no cost, no obligation issue. It is a Quwa Pro article, so it does for the market intelligence tier. So, I mean, if you're in the industry, if you're a decision maker, if you're in the armed forces, whatever, if you're in that sphere, I do recommend you check it out. Quwa Pro gives you access to this and all of our other market intelligence pieces, which gives you a deeper insight on to how decision makers around the world are thinking, especially in Pakistan and the Middle East, but also some of the more intricacies of the defense industry. I think when it comes to reporting on the Pakistani defense industry and getting into the details and deep aspects of it, I don't think anyone matches Quwa, to be frank. So I do recommend you do check it out. And if you can, do subscribe. If you're part of an organization, an institution, or a company, we can also discuss bulk and institutional licensing if it helps. So that way you don't, as an individual, have to be on the hook for it, but maybe your company might be interested in this market intelligence. It's a good way to have a window into the Pakistani defense market, the Middle Eastern, North African defense markets, without too much upfront risk, basically. So once again, I thank you. Take care and bye.